What's up, people? Today I'd like to continue our little discussion about painterly photography and dig into some of the more technical details of how you can make your own photographs look more painterly. There's a lot you can do in post-processing to make your photo look more like a painting, but the editing process really starts before you take the picture. If you start off by doing a little research and refining your idea and not just randomly snapping away, you'll be able to hone in on something that's going to lend itself to the look in the end. First is the composition. The composition is traditionally really well thought out in paintings. It's not necessarily random. Some abstract work for sure, but for the most part, traditionally a lot of thought goes into a painting, from an initial sketch to first drawing it in on the canvas to actually realizing the piece. Anything that might be disruptive of the composition is just left out of the picture. There's no reason to paint in something unless it somehow relates to everything else and helps the meaning of the painting be conveyed, or whatever the artist's intent is. It's literally impossible to include something in a painting that isn't intentional. So one thing that's going to make your photograph look like a painting is a well thought out composition. While random snapshots and fun askew angles and all of that are great, they're not going to help your photo look like a painting if that's what you're trying to achieve. Let's look back over the work of some of the photographers that we reviewed in the last episode and see how their formal compositions lend to a painterly look. While there's a lot of randomness and energy in Saul Leiter's compositions, you can still see a few very standard classical techniques. For example, the way that he divides the canvas down the middle, creating a symmetry, and then placing these umbrellas here sort of on the thirds, if you're familiar with the rule of thirds in composition. Here in this piece by Gregory Crewdson, we can see a very well thought out and structured composition. The use of a technique called subframing, here with the lights, creating sort of a frame around this central figure here. And then a lot of leading lines. We have these compositional lines taking us to the car here. We have these lines leading us to the central figure again. Here in this other piece by Crewdson, we can see how strongly he uses the leading lines in the image, as well as a little bit more of subframing. Here again with the street lights, creating with the tire tracks here a bit of a frame for this car here. We have everything around the sidewalk creates a bit of a subframe for this character here, as well as an even smaller subframe around this character here. We have a lot of negative space here with the snow, so this car stands out really well, but we still have these leading lines here taking you in with the tire tracks toward the car. We also have these leading lines here framing in this figure, and these two work together to help you notice this woman here, who's sort of a surprise you don't notice right away. In these medium-length portraits by Erwin Olaf, you can see, again, some subframing going on here. All of the strong contrast leading lines leading you to the figure, and then the arc of her body in the bright yellow, and her arm here, all keeping your eye centrally focused on her face. And then here we see the same thing. The strong contrasted lines in the image are all taking you toward this woman. And the line of her body also takes you right up to her face. Using some of the same characters on the same sets in the same series here, you see that Olaf, again using subframing here around this character, leaving this subframe for the other central figure here. And again, the leading lines taking you in towards the character. The line of her body taking you up towards her face. And using some other compositional techniques to make this character over here feel very isolated. For one, there's a concept called looking room, and he doesn't have any. If someone is facing the edge of a frame closely or looking off frame like that, it tends to give us an uncomfortable feeling, and we feel very claustrophobic. Here again, you see the leading lines are taking you, framing in and taking you over to the character, the line of her body, the line of the table, everything taking you right here, She's sort of framed in by some of these lines that create kind of terminal points in the composition. These all keep your eyes from wandering too far away. The second aspect I'd like to talk about is perspective. Generally, when you're laying out a painting, you're working from some kind of grid. More often than not, an artist works from a 1 or a 2-point perspective. But the curved lines that you can get out of a camera and the distortion of the flat planes through the shape of the lens kind of gives it away. So one of the aspects that really helps a photograph look like a painting is to make sure that your verticals, your horizontals, your diagonals are all very well straightened out and fit into a more illustrative perspective grid like you're used to seeing in a painting. Fanho's work, especially around these stairs, gives us a good example of a solid 1-point perspective. You can see all of these lines here taking you back towards the one vanishing point off screen here, and you're basically parallel with the horizontals. Back to this Crewdson image, the 2-point perspective that he likes to employ is a strong part of his compositions as well. Here the perspectives all work towards this same vanishing point, and another vanishing point is introduced with this non-horizontal plane here. But as you can see, we're not working with a third point. All of the verticals are still vertical. Looking back at these two images by Olaf, we see that this first one is in a 1-point perspective because all of the horizontals and verticals are perfectly aligned on the flat plane. And here the vanishing point actually takes you directly to this character. As you can see, if I extend these lines out from that point, they all help to bring you over to him. This image, because we are not perpendicular with one of the planes, is a 2-point perspective. The vanishing points of these lines are way off frame here, but you can see that they are not parallel. And the verticals, as before, are perfectly vertical. The third aspect is color. And most importantly is to limit your color palette. If you want it to look like a painting, sure, paintings can have all kinds of colors, but they're way more impactful, I would argue, the less colors that they have. And if you look through the work of some of your favorite painters, you're going to see that even the artists themselves often had favorite reds or favorite browns or favorite blues and used that palette pretty consistently throughout their work. And beyond just restricting your color palette, it also helps for your colors to be motivated, conveying some kind of mood. There's a strong psychology to color that painters have used for ages to try to convey the feeling that goes along with the piece. And rather than the flat reality colors that you'll generally get when you take a picture of something, if you can restrict the number of colors in your scene and what colors they are and how they help represent the mood, your work's going to look more like a painting. This series illustrates a little more deeply what I had mentioned in a previous video about Erwin Olaf's attention to his color scheme. Here you can see these cream beige tones with this little bit of a green cast to them. It's a very common theme in his work. Greens create a sort of psychological unease. We subconsciously think of things that might make us sick, especially with these certain greens. And here in the Keyhole series, where he's exploring themes of loneliness and shame, it supports the mood that he's trying to convey. Here we have 3 images from Todd Hido's house hunting series, and you can see the predominance of blue, green, and red between these images. But if you look within each image, you're also going to see a very restricted color palette. The blue with the yellow contrasted, this green here contrasted with a reddish tone, and the yellow, and then this red here in a more analogous color scheme with the orange and the yellow. This is again Todd Hido, but in this case he's using these browns to evoke a sense of time, especially with the wood-paneled interiors and the carpets also supporting that theme. One thing that I and other children of the 80s and 70s are going to relate to. The fourth thing that you'll notice that makes a photograph look like a painting is the tonality of it. When people paint things the way that they see them, generally speaking, there's smooth gradations between each color. There are no sharp cutoffs, except maybe in the case of reflections on glass, things like that. You're not going to find any crushed shadows or blown highlights in a painting. That's something that happens as a result of the photography process, but a painting based on reality, unless the artist intentionally imposes that, generally is not going to have stark transitions between the lighter and the darker tones. Here in this image you can see there are only a few complete blacks and whites in the eyes of the cat, where it's shiny and reflective and hard-edged. Looking through his fur, you don't see anything blow out, and all the changes of tone are very subtle and continuous. And the same in the shadows here, where it never goes quite to black, and there are quite a few different values of brown. This picture by Gregory Crewdson from his Cathedral of the Pines series is an excellent example of what I'm talking about. This image couldn't really be taken this way with a camera. That is to say, it probably required multiple exposures and a lot of work in post-processing. In reality, there are too many dynamics in this scene to capture it in one frame, but we have a much stronger dynamic range, which is the number of different tones that we can see between black and white with our eyes than a camera can pick up. And our eyes adjust to what we look at, so we don't ever perceive blown highlights and crushed shadows the way that a camera does. And the reason that I feel that this image is excellent is because there is a behind the scenes version of this image. And here you can see what a simple snapshot of this scene, all of the ways that a camera would have blown the highlights, as you can see on the girl here especially, and along this pillow a little bit, and crushed the shadows down in these darker areas. Here in another image by Erwin Olaf is a great example. On the face of it, you would expect these strongly sun-drenched windows to have either blown white, or if you had exposed for those windows, the interior would have been too dark. If you look at this color picker here, I can demonstrate it doesn't really ever go to a perfect full white. And again, if we demonstrate even in the darkest shadows, we don't completely find our way to black except in a few key areas, and when we do, the gradation toward that black is so smooth you don't see the transition. The reason I would describe this as a painterly effect is that in the painting world, especially in the classical sense, people would paint what they see with their eyes, and they wouldn't think to limit themselves the way that a camera limits what it can pick up. The fifth way you can make your photograph look more like a painting is by including certain textures. The obvious one is to put textures in that actually resemble paint, but also organic textures, dripping water textures, anything that distorts the plane behind it, the texture of glass itself. These things can all help create an organic and textural feel like you would find on a painting. So if you can find textures to include in your photographs that remind you of paint or canvas or different grounds, those are going to help you along the way. Here we see the streaks in the window creating a texture very reminiscent of paint, as well as the sign lettering that's worn away, looking as though it's been painted. The whole thing has an impressionistic feel. Here in this image by Erwin Olaf, everything is highly refined and much less sloppy, but the choices of these flat textures here and the organic shapes going on in the chair and in the wood grain, I feel very much mimic the look and the texture of paint. Here are some more examples by Leiter where the textures on the window support it, but the diffusion of the entire image by looking through the foggy glass pulls away a lot of the detail and gives it almost an expressionist look. Todd Hido also liked to shoot through rain-drenched windows to create an impressionist quality in his work. Here in this more extreme example, it almost looks like it's all big rough paint strokes. And the sixth and final thing that I'd like to focus on is what I would call a camera tell. So you want to avoid the different things that a camera sees differently from the way that people see. For example, you won't see a lot of over sharpening in a painterly image. That is a very photographic and especially digitally photographic process that isn't really natural to the way that we see, and very difficult to pull off with paint if you tried. Also lighting effects, lens flares, halos coming off of things, light leaks and things like that that give away the fact that you're looking at a photograph. Or chromatic aberration for that matter. A lot of the times when you zoom in on your photos, you'll see those magentas and greens on the edges of everything, but you don't see that in reality, and it's highly unlikely that a painter would include that unless their source material was a photograph and that's what they were going for. Or the starbursts that you see when you work at really small apertures. Sure, those look really cool in night street scenes and landscapes with the sun shining through the trees and whatnot, but again, they're not something we see in the real world, so they're not generally something you find in a painting. Another one is a shallow depth of field. Sure, there are some paintings that utilize a shallow depth of field, but especially going into the past pre-photography when no one really saw the world in this way, everything was rendered in focus, everything was rendered in detail. The exception is that sometimes more detail is put on the central figure of a painting, and then the outside background area is a little looser. And to that effect, I could see a shallow depth of field maybe working. But in most cases, the look that you're going to get with the bokeh and all of that is going to give away the fact that it's a photograph. And then there's an arguable one, which is motion blur. If you leave your shutter open too long and the person walking by blurs, that's generally not the way that a painting looks. But I'll say this one's arguable because sometimes I've seen people leave the shutter open and intentionally move the camera and to create sort of an abstract expressionist brushstroke, which has its own kind of painterly look. This image here shows a phenomenon called chromatic aberration. This is one of those things that a camera does that if the human eye does, you don't perceive it. You can see these purple fringes that appear around the edges of everything. Now there's no reason that a painter would have included something like this in their work unless they were working from a photograph. You can also see some rather heavy diffraction happening and destroying the details of these tree limbs in the back here. Now if we take this piece by Crewdson, some of that may have existed up in the trees previously, but it has been clearly minimized and probably edited out and retouched in post to remove that dead giveaway that this was shot with a camera. Here I've zoomed in on his trees and you can see there's no purple fringing and no diffraction destroying everything. It is a little hard to tell because I couldn't find a higher resolution image, but you can really tell when you look at the prints. They're not this blobby and distorted in real life. So here's another camera tell, another giveaway, the starburst that is created from using a small aperture on a camera. This is actually an effect of the blades inside of the camera that create the aperture that the shot is taken through. And landscape photographers often like to do this. It has a really great look to it, but it's obviously something you wouldn't see with the naked eye that you would see with the camera. And so it doesn't relate completely to our direct experience the way someone would have represented this in a painting. Here in this piece by Hido, you can see an example of avoiding completely those starbursts and creating more of the effect of how we would perceive an overly bright light in a dark scene. Another thing that gives away a camera is noise. In the film days, this noise equated to the grain on the film itself. And in the digital era, it's the pixelation from the sensors and also their inability to perfectly capture color. That is, when you zoom in on a digital image, you often see noise of different colors than the main color of what was captured. But here, all of that evidence has been retouched away. You see nothing but a smooth gradation of skin tones going on. The yellows here, with just a little subtle color shift in the shadows, which is perfectly normal to a limited painterly color palette. And the grain and the texture that does exist in the image is very controlled. For this last example by William Klein, I just want to show you how some of these dead giveaways, these camera tells, have an amazing, fresh, lively, vibrant feeling to them, but not necessarily a painterly quality. The composition here is very random and off-kilter and energetic. That isn't to say there isn't any form of subframing or leading lines or anything that are helping it out, but it does have a very candid feel to it. You can see through his use of the wide-angle lens here that the verticals and the horizontals have been subtly distorted. You'll notice this line curves away. This certainly isn't impossible to do in a painting, but especially looking through the history of painting before people were using lenses, it's incredibly uncommon to introduce something like that. If you look at the face of this character here, you can see this blur along the edge. from the motion. Another dead giveaway of photography that could possibly be emulated in a painting, but isn't generally the way that a painter would work. You can see the limited dynamic range at play here. Even though this is a black and white image, it crushes all the way down to pure black in many places, and also flares up to a pure white, and the transition between is rather stark. And lastly, if we zoom in here for a second, you can see the heavy effects of film grain in this photo. Yet another dead giveaway that this was taken with a camera. So I hope you found all of that helpful. I'd like to share an article with you. When I was doing research on this topic, the best article I could find on the internet, one that gave me a handful of the ideas that I used here, was by a photographer named Ming. His blog has been an endless source of inspiration for me. He's very thoughtful, he's both artful and technical, and just a font of knowledge. I highly recommend you check him out. But for today, let's just take a look at his article in painterly photography, and I can walk you through a few of his examples as well. This is a topic that Ming's been exploring as well as practicing himself. He talks a lot about the influence that he felt from Edward Hopper and some of his experimentation while he was in Havana, Cuba. Here you can see some of the elements that we talked about. A very formal composition. The paint on the car is actually very textural and adds to the brushstroke look of the whole thing. This one here, creating a layered impressionist look by the reflections off of water, kind of like what we were talking about with glass. And this is an excellent example of the forced perspective I was talking about. Well, I really hope you guys found these tips helpful. If you have any further ideas that I didn't explore that you think are cool, you'd like to share, leave them down in the comments for me and anyone else that stumbles across this video. If you like this topic and other creative topics like this, don't forget to subscribe so you know when I put out something new. As always, thanks for hanging out. Until next time, peace.